I'm Andrew Warnes. I'm a reader in American Studies in the School of English at the University of Leeds. And I'm going to be talking today about Jim Crow. The title of the podcast is The Strange Career of Jim Crow. As I'm sure you've already discovered, that this is one of the most shocking and shameful episodes in not just American but Western history. I think that although it's very harrowing, it's also an extremely fascinating historical period. And there's a kind of strange phenomenon at work in the period of racial segregation in the American South, where these singularly harsh and unpromising circumstances somehow prove to be a remarkably fertile soil for genius to flourish. This is a time of great men and great women in America. The segregation system produces such cultural and political great figures as John Coltrane, Bessie Smith, William Faulkner, Martin Luther King, Robert Johnson, Little Richard, and I don't even need to mention Elvis in that list. One thing I think you should bear in mind is that this means that researching the Jim Crow era can actually be a lot of fun, particularly in the age of the internet. You can learn an awful lot about Jim Crow on YouTube. If you just punch in Martin Luther King, punch in Sam Cooke, a change is going to come, any of those names that I've just mentioned, go on to Spotify to think about Chuck Berry's lyrics. You know, there's a whole range of resources available to you on the internet, which, if you approach them in the right way, can actually shed incredible light on this period, alongside more kind of conventional forms of scholarship, of course. So I hope you're enjoying the challenge of this research. And in a way, I thought that what I would do today is try not to interfere with that research, try not to add another layer to it, but instead try to relate our topic, this strange career of Jim Crow, to an important academic perspective that I would imagine is a little bit less familiar to you. The perspective that I have in mind today can be traced to the work of one man in particular, the radical French theorist Michel Foucault. A word of warning might be advisable here. Be advised, if you're planning to go to university, at some point your lecturer might start rattling on about this guy. He or she might even turn his name into an adjective and might start to talk about a Foucauldian effect. And if you're really unlucky, they might start to make reference to something called Foucauldian biopolitics, or a Foucauldian discourse of power. That was definitely my experience as an undergraduate. I remember that Foucault's name came up at key moments in the lectures that I attended as a student, and that whenever it did come up, words that I thought I knew the meaning of, like body or politics, suddenly seemed to acquire these strange and enigmatic new meanings. So I guess there's a kind of confession here. Any mention of Foucault in these lectures tended to mark one of those moments where I kind of switched off, really, and sort of accepted that there were some aspects of my studies that I was less than interested in. What I should have done, of course, was ask my lecturers what these somewhat cryptic phrases actually meant. I should have persevered, getting them to explain why they thought Foucault was so important to understanding the particular historical topic that we were discussing. This then is what I'm going to try to do now. I'm going to try to explain one of Foucault's central intellectual insights, and I'm going to try to relate it to the rise of segregation law across the American South after the 1870s. The 1960s and 70s were a time of intense radical thought across Europe, and in France in particular. But no ideas were more resonant or profound than those that Foucault propounded in a series of extraordinary books. Madness and Civilization, The Order of Things, Discipline and Punish, The History of Sexuality. These titles perhaps help illustrate the extraordinary range of Foucault's thinking, but the best and most accessible of them, Discipline and Punish, also encapsulates a set of ethical concerns common to them all. Discipline and Punish is a work of history broad in its sweep as well as its implications. What it chronicles, to put it as simply as I can, is how disciplinary or political power has been transformed since the Enlightenment. By Enlightenment, we mean the 18th century, and specifically the rise of science and rational thought and the decline of superstitious forms of religion that occurred over the course of the 1700s. This is a period of expanding scientific knowledge, a time in which new academic disciplines from botany to zoology rose to catalogue and tabulate the world around us. And Discipline and Punish's central insight is that government in this period began to apply these rational principles of organisation and control to the people over whom they ruled. Foucault never quite comes out and says so, but he strongly implies that governments before about 1770 or 1780 were more or less vacant from ordinary life and became palpable to people only in times of extraordinary crisis or crime. In Britain, as in America in these years, government was blunt and commanding and brutal when it needed to be. But with important exceptions, it wasn't always that interested in private life or what people thought. Before the Enlightenment, that is, governments responded to wrongdoing through what Discipline and Punish calls, quote, the spectacle of the scaffold, torturing or executing the criminal in public in order to keep others in line. But after the Enlightenment, and increasingly into the 19th century, governments begin to shy away from this somewhat medieval form of punishment, and they seek a more thorough and rational way of controlling errant behaviour. They begin, in a word, to build more prisons. Nor do they just build them, they reinvent them. In Britain and America as well as France, those in government begin to design prisons increasingly not just to subjugate and punish and incarcerate, but to observe and regulate and perhaps even rehabilitate inmates. We see rising in this period what Foucault calls the panoptic institution. Prisons in which long corridors radiate like spokes on a bicycle wheel from a central position that can be occupied by the prison guard, who is therefore kind of placed into a position of ultimate authority and who can enact what Foucault calls at one point unverifiable surveillance, keeping an eye on inmates, making sure that anyone who steps out of line will be observed. So it's a more kind of thorough, intimate and insidious form of disciplinary authority that we see rising in this period. That's the kind of thesis of Discipline and Punish. Discipline and Punish, though, isn't just a history of the modern prison. Rather, it takes this rise as emblematic, something that epitomises the major changes going on over the course of the 19th century. For the observation of inmates wasn't just central to the design of Victorian prisons. It also informed the construction of schools, hospitals, asylums and offices during this period. Here too we find long corridors radiating from a central space of observation occupied by those in authority. Here too inmates or patients or pupils are herded down pre-planned routes in full sight of some policing or disciplinary power. Here too then power, this is in schools, in hospitals and asylums, here too power is no longer absent from ordinary life, is no longer limited to interventions at times of emergency. Power, instead, seeks to get inside the mind of the individual and regulate his or her desires. It wants to generate what Foucault calls docility. It wants to force the population into institutions that will then require them to conform to approved moral and sexual norms. This then is what those lecturers meant when they used a phrase like Foucauldian biopolitics or a Foucauldian discourse of power. They meant a modern form of disciplinary control that seeks to monitor behaviour and quite literally to regulate bodies and their contact with one another. The very fact that Jim Crow law and etiquette took its name from a wandering minstrel can make this social system of the American South seem antiquated and anything but modern. The sheer and sometimes absurd extremity of Jim Crow can also make it seem, like the apartheid system of South Africa, like the last gasp of a dying system, a sort of desperate last throw of the dice on the part of white supremacy. There's some truth to this view. The Jim Crow laws that got put onto the statute books of various southern states after the 1870s were put there by white southern men who could not cope with the abolition of slavery. They were trying to bring a halt to progress. They were trying to turn the clock back. They were trying to bring the American South back to a position of settled white supremacy that they associated with the period of plantation slavery. But nostalgia is in itself a phenomenon that we can associate with modernity. And the means by which Southern lawmakers sought to turn back the clock, the instrument of the new regime, in itself distinguished the Jim Crow system from the slavery regime that it sentimentalized. Jim Crow, I'm suggesting, heralds the appearance of a new kind of political authority in American life. Orwellian and insidious, this new political authority, what Foucault would have called this new disciplinary regime, saw a higher level of emotional control, a greater say over the conduct of individual lives. It wasn't content simply to secure the brutal economic exploitation of African Americans in the manner of early slave law. Instead, it wanted to regulate the private and the public lives, not just of these black Americans, but also of their white compatriots, upholding moral standards through its pursuit of the impossible dream of complete racial separation. It might go without saying that it doesn't necessarily follow that Jim Crow was therefore worse than slavery. Any attempt to compare these two grotesque social systems in such terms would, I think, be fruitless, to say the least. But it bears repetition that slavery was a ruthless economic system that took little interest in what African people thought, and that did its utmost instead to treat those people not as people but as commodities. And this meant that many of those in authority under the old slavery regime were relatively indifferent to questions of social behaviour and tolerated a far greater level of spontaneous interaction between black and white people than would be possible under Jim Crow law. Some befriended black Americans, some tolerated interracial marriage, and few of them exhibited the kind of paranoia about uncontrolled moments of intimacy that would become a hallmark of Jim Crow's advocates. And so I'm suggesting that the Jim Crow system represents a new and more Foucauldian form of government in American life. One which wants to get into the bedroom and the barroom, wants to control every aspect of daily life. The panoptic features of new forms of disciplinary control described in Discipline and Punish create new divisions, new separations in almost every area of Southern life. Let me just draw this podcast to a close by describing one of the many absurdities produced by this rigid demarcation of public life. I'd just like to quote from Leon Litwack's fabulous history, Trouble in Mind, Black Southerners in the Age of Jim Crow. If you can get your hands on either of Litwack's major histories of slavery and its aftermath, that would be really would be time well spent. In this anecdote, Litwack tells us, quote, "During a trial in Virginia in 1906, the deputy sheriff handed a character witness the Bible used for administering oaths. But the presiding judge, believing the light-coloured witness E.A. Johnson to be a white man, reprimanded the deputy for giving him the wrong Bible. 'That one over there is the one for the use of white people,' he declared. 'Not that I am a stickler about such matters, but if there are to be different Bibles kept for the races, then you must not get them mixed up that way. Have a different place for them and keep them apart.' In this podcast, I've tried to suggest that the paranoia that led some white Southerners to fear the very touch of their black neighbours needs to be seen as a modern phenomenon. Jim Crow laws were without doubt related to slavery, and without doubt they sought to restore some of the racial certainties that some white Southerners associated with that old regime. But this nostalgia in itself indicates the sheer modernity of Jim Crow, as do the breadth and insidious nature of its laws. Jim Crow was indeed a version of the Foucauldian panopticon, a disciplinary regime that wanted to treat the world as a prison and that wanted to regulate the lives of its white as well as its black inmates. So, C. Van Woodward was right in his famous revisionist history to talk of Jim Crow's strange career. But we should not confuse such strangeness with uniqueness. We should not think that strangeness means that Jim Crow was somehow a peculiar throwback or an anachronism or something which ultimately had no place in the modern West. Instead, Jim Crow, like the rise of fascism in interwar Europe, should remind us that the process of modernity or modernisation doesn't always progress inexorably towards freedom, and has just as easily in the past led people into prisons, controlling institutions, as it has democracy.